Michele K. Troy is a professor of English at Hillyer College at the University of Hartford. She studies Anglo-American literary modernism in continental Europe in the decades between two world wars. We're here to talk about Strange Bird, the Albatross Press, and the Third Reich, which was published by Yale in 2017. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you so much for having me, Nigel.
The book ends in a nunnery.
A most unexpected place, it does.
What you did was you went there in search of a longtime female employee of Albatross, who you didn't know too much about, but she contributed quite a lot to the firm. Perhaps you could talk a bit about her.
Sure. I think from the beginning, I was intrigued by her because she's operating in a very male world. And I was, of course, looking in archives, and in archives, you find letters and you're seeing who the correspondence is from and to. I should say, too, that when I first found out about this firm by accident, which I can talk about later, of course, I started, the names of the leaders are the ones who come up, and those are male. And so I was able to find a little bit of information in different places about the male figures, but this woman, I watched her also rise in the ranks. She was an assistant editor, became an associate editor in the 30s. And I watched her fend off all sorts of hostility towards Albatross in the 30s, because British and American authors were rightly wondering, where are my honoraria? I'm not getting money. Why am I not getting money? And that's a story of, not being able to get money out of Germany. But yes?
Just your bracelets are banging onto the table.
Let me take them off. Yeah, no problem. So I want to say I became intrigued by her because I felt that she was a very central figure, in fact, in holding the firm down and keeping, smoothing out these ripples that were happening, keeping the reputation of the firm afloat. And yet there was almost nothing on her. So I was quite curious early on to understand what it would have been like to be her operating in a male publishing world, a largely male publishing world. And in fact, one of my oldest friends whom I talked about, with whom I made that trip to the nunnery, happened to live in the neighborhood of Paris where the Albatross had its first office. She had just recently moved there. And I said to her, well, I need to go to the Rue Boulard. And she said, well, it's right around the corner. Let's go see. And then she also said, well, there is someone in the street named Hamburg, and that's sort of an unusual name. And then, of course, there was all a flutter about, I wonder if it could be a relative somehow, and it's an unusual name. And anyway.
What was her name again?
Sonia Hamburg.
Okay.
She was the daughter of Mark Hamburg, who was a Russian Jewish pianist who had become quite famous in England. And the family lived in London. She went to college, one of the women's colleges at the time. And then she came to Paris afterwards. And I was thinking, who is this adventurous young woman who launches into this very male world in another country, in another language? And I just found her fascinating.
But you were disappointed because you thought perhaps she might be able to talk to her sister, but her sister was just about on her deathbed, right?
Well, this was it was such a moving moment in the research. And I should say that, scholars are in archives, but when you start to look at people too, you run into really moving terrain very fast. And what had happened is I had no thought of finding her sister at all when I went to the nunnery. I was going to the convent because the only thing that we could really figure out about her online was that she had been in this particular convent outside of Paris. So we tracked down this convent, we contacted the person there, and we did find an now older nun, who had worked with Sonia Hamburg, or Mother Mary, as she was called at the time, in the print shop. So she had stayed in publishing and printing, but switched her realm. So we went to talk with this very elegant older nun who herself had a very interesting backstory. She then turned to me at this one point and said, well, would you like to speak with her sister? I froze. I thought, she's alive, and as you said, then we called. This was before I had a cell phone or anybody had a cell phone. We called from the convent, and we got her son, and she could no longer speak. She passed away 3 days later.
You sort of touched her, but you didn't.
It was a really interesting reminder very early in the process of how history is always slipping away every day. And these witnesses to the things that we're interested in learning about are very much slipping away. I had this feeling a lot actually when I first started doing this research, because I lived in Hamburg from 1989 to 1991. And I didn't know about Albatross then. I only found out about Albatross much later. And by the time I learned about Albatross, there's that, coulda, shoulda, woulda feeling. Oh, if I had only known back then I could have perhaps, there were certainly people alive in the 80s whom I could have spoken with, including Christian Wagner, they would say Wagner in German, but including his wife, who had a role in the founding of the firm in Paris. So these women's stories, they're very evasive. I did try, but it was hard to track them down.
We are going to talk a bit about book collecting here. You can go into a bookstore, but if you don't know about a book or an author, then they're invisible. But as soon as you do learn about them and come across them, it can be very exciting.
Well, and I know too that you do some literary tourism, travel around books. And one of the things I started to realize is, I've always loved secondhand bookstores, but once I found out about Albatross, it completely changed the way that I saw cities in Europe when I was traveling, because everywhere I went, I would say, okay, where are the secondhand bookstores? I found my way into them and I started looking around. And in fact, the first conference I did, the first paper I gave at the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, Publishing, which you'll know, the Sharp community, a lively band of scholars from all over the place. It was at The Hague. I remember it had been an amazing conference. I'm a literary scholar. I had never really interacted with book historians or publishing historians. And I do confess it, I skipped the keynote and went out to a couple of secondhand bookshops, and I found 10. I had never been looking for an Albatross book in my life. They were just wedged in with the paperbacks. Nobody knew, by the way, in the secondhand shops that I went into, that they were there. They said, oh, well, paperbacks are just all in the same place. They're over there. But no one knew about the firm. And I found that also quite a testament to the fact that this firm that used to be it was really massive. It dominated the market for English language paperbacks in the 1930s. And then nobody knows about them. They disappeared down the rabbit hole of history somehow.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm able to place very, very often. I'm able to place exactly where I bought specific books. And I know that I bought a couple of the Albatross books that I have in Becherel, France, the book town there.
Could I ask you one question? You do have a few titles that you sent me this morning in email, and there's a note there from Marga Enoch, Kurt Enochs, one of the Albatross leaders, one of his second wife. Are you able to tell quickly the story of how you landed those?
It's very boring, that one. It came in Kurt Enoch's memoir that was written for his family. I believe I just found that online. That's the one, except you've got a Glassine.
I have a Glassine copy. This came to me by accident or by good fortune years later. I had to copy the whole thing back at the New York Public Library in the day, in that beautiful vaulted room. But then a year ago, I received this in the mail from someone who was a friend of a friend. His name is Mark Kramer, and his father had been in the publishing world with Enoch in the 50s, 60s. And he happened to have a copy and sent it to me.
Okay, that's great. I don't really have one up on you except for the letter.
You do.
Do you have one of those?
No, but we can trade. I have the Glassine cover and you have the letter from Margaret Enoch. I actually think you win that battle. I think the letter from Margaret Enoch might trump my Glassine cover.
Right. Okay, you talk, and we've just talked about not knowing about so many people and so many women too, and it is typical. The way you described her is typical of how so many publishing firms operated. It was women who did the work and kind of kept things going, and yet didn't get so much of the credit.
Could I interject and also say that Jean Holroyd Reese, the director's wife, played an enormous role partly in reining in her husband and keeping him focused on the tasks at hand, and partly just, being part of that world of winning authors and all of that.
So speaking of lost history, you quote the sculptor Alberto Giacometti about working with clay. He says, it's impossible to capture the entirety of a figure, and that you're suspended between detail and the whole, but that from details you form the entirety, and they afford beauty to shapes. And you're referencing that in terms of the work that you did in this book. So maybe can you expand on that a bit?
Do you mean to talk about the work itself or the dilemma the work left me with?
To talk about the impossibility of capturing the entirety of a figure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as a younger scholar, you sort of know you can't always find everything, but you have a sense of zeal about the quest. And in a way, almost like being in a new relationship. When you're in a relationship with a new research project, you have all this zeal and you have a bit of naivete also about the process and how easy it's going to be to find particular pieces of information. And, really, there is a kind of impossibility of finding the whole, but I realize that's true also of the people around us. So why wouldn't it be true of the people we're historically researching? Still, I would say it was an amazingly fascinating quest, because there are bits that show up in the archive, and then suddenly you have a lucky stroke and someone passes on an email to someone else, and you get the best example of that is I had been looking for the Albatross director's daughter for quite some time. I knew from a Scottish scholar, Alistair McCleary, that she existed somewhere in France, but, try to hunt down, it's very hard to find people. And suddenly one day I get an email from Matthias Wagner, who's Christian Wagner's son of one of the Albatross leaders, the three main people. And he says to me, oh, by the way, you'll never imagine who contacted me. Here she is, and I'll send on this email to you. And I mentioned this only to say that some of the details we find are in our control and some are out of our control. And I think in the end, I started to just appreciate the process more. So early on, I thought, for example, I just file a Freedom of Information Act request on John Holroyd Reese, and I have the MI5 number for his file, and he's the Albatross director. There has to be something there, and he has this intriguing story. I have a file number. I can find him. And then the Brits write me back, and there's nothing on him. They can't find the file. And I go to the British National Archives, and there are things from they have a catalog of all of the correspondence in the British Foreign Office, and these teasing, lovely little leads of subject lines. And you think, oh, great, I just go into that file and I find it. And in fact, it's been destroyed. And so I think by the end of writing the book, I'd had a number of these experiences. And you come to a point where there's this little bit of, what's the right word? It's sort of this light sadness that you haven't been able to figure out the whole thing, but there's also an acceptance. So I guess that's what I would say, that I realized how much the process, the putting together the details, was actually the meaning of the thing. Yeah. Because that's how I forged all these relationships also with these amazing people. The research in the end really changed my life, and I hadn't expected that. So there are answers I don't have about some of the figures that I would love to have. But on the other hand, the trade-off was beyond the book. It was putting together the story of the book, which was a detective hunt, but it was also the relationships I forged in the process with the Albatross, the children of the Albatross leaders and their families, which is really amazing.
Yeah, I find that with the interviews that I do, that the really fascinating stuff is the detail, is the specifics. Mm-hmm. I don't want generalities. It is the details that are fascinating and exciting and lead to other details.
That process is like the Hansel and Gretel hunt through the woods. They leave the crumbs behind, and yes. You are, as a researcher, and you know this yourself, you're following crumbs. And if you're patient, then you keep finding new ones. I had that happen numerous times also with, for example, there's one really boring document I found, well, first I should say, when I went looking in Germany for Albatross, the logical place is to go to Berlin, to the Bundesarchiv in Lichterfelde. So I went there, and I, again, armed and ready, here I go. And I found there were only 4 hits in the catalog for Albatross. They were very minor files. I only later realized, after I had gotten home, hey, I need to be thinking about, to get to the details, I have to look elsewhere for the crumbs. I need to go to who were the people in charge of them during the war. And I realized, oh, Reichskommissar for enemy property is who I need to go. They were managed during the war, right? So I need to find that. But it's interesting there too, you have to know what the crumbs mean, because one of the documents was so boring. It was just a list of addresses. But for me, it was like, oh, wow, this shows all the people who were kept informed about Albatross, all of the different ministries. And that was the thing that detail led me to another archive, the political archive in Berlin, where I found a number of really important documents that helped me put the story together.
It's true. It's like you get a detail and you plug it into a Google search because you don't know what's going to come up from that. Right.
But it's nice to know you like the details. There are a lot of them in the book. It was also a challenge, and this was one of the great comments actually that my editors gave me. They said you're so immersed in these details, and you need to pull out to 3,000 feet or 10,000 feet and let us see from above why these details matter and how they create a pattern.
Well, the story is of Albatross, which is a strange bird, as you say, because of the fact that it's funded by British Jewish interests. It's in English. The idea is to reach the continental market. It was set up in 1931, but the big question for me is, why weren't the British and the American publishers doing it themselves? Why didn't they go into Europe with their own books?
The way that I understand that is that it was cost prohibitive. In their view, the market wasn't large enough at the time. And there's some interesting documents in British archives. I have more evidence on the British side about this than I do on the American. But I mean, your question is a really good one, by the way, because after the war, of course, the British and American publishers do exactly that. And they're doing it sometimes in partnership. Well, actually, in both cases, they're doing it in partnership with their own governments to create schemes that allow the buyers in different countries in Europe to circumvent having to pay foreign currency because no one had any foreign currency. So, but I would say before the war, it's quite interesting. You get a sense very strongly in the 1920s, looking at British agent correspondence, looking at the Journal for the Society of Authors, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but there are these debates about how to handle continental editions. And in the mid-20s, there's a sudden spike. I've seen Tauchnitz sales figures and budget accounts. There's a spike in about 1926. It was astounding in 1 year that it would go up quite that much. So I think a piece of what happened is it was too much to organize. There were too many logistics. It was easier. One issue was that it was easier to let this German firm Tauchnitz manage it and manage the distribution of paperbacks. The other big reason, though, is that the British publishers, especially, were really wedded to the hardcover. They wanted to sell that hardcover because they made way more money off of selling one hardcover. So they were desperately holding to their hardcover market, and they didn't want to do paperbacks all over Europe and miss that first run hardcover.
But couldn't they sell the hardcover into Europe, or was it just too prohibitive?
They did. They did. They tried to sell the hardcover in Europe. And actually, Lise Giant is a scholar who's done some work on that and knows more about the hardcover market than I do. But I would say that I think they were kind of in this both and mode. We're going to work on the hardcover. We're going to let Tauchnitz manage the paperback market. And what started to happen is that as Tauchnitz is getting more popular, and this is Albatross's precursor, whom they came into the market to beat out, but as this market for English language books in Europe is growing, suddenly you have buyers in Europe saying, why am I going to pay for the hardcover when in 6 months or a year I can get the paperback of the same book? So it actually starts to push back and threaten the hardcover market. And it's at that point that the Brits start to think about, why aren't we doing this? And in fact, it's in my book. I'm forgetting which group of publishers and agents got together. They get together and are forging their own firm. They have 3 or 4 publishers gathering together to try to erode that market. But Albatross by then is in the market in the 30s and making great strides with their own branding. And I think that was really one of the innovations of Albatross, was to come in the middle of the hardcover and the paperback and say, you guys are denigrating the paperback, but the paperback can be of quality. It's not the format that matters, it's the form. That was part of the genius of Albatross. And Holroyd Reese, the director, was a master in typography and was good friends with Hans Marderstieg, who was a master printer. And he, in fact, is responsible for the beautiful design of the cover with the bird and the kind of rectangular. And they did the proportions according to the golden mean, what is pleasing to the eye, how does it also, and they were very practical, how does it fit into the pocket? They changed the nature of the way the paperback was viewed.
Right. Perhaps you could give just a thumbnail of Tauchnitz or Taunitz, or however you.
Sure, yeah. So Tauchnitz was a firm founded in 1840, or I should say the collection in English language started in 1840, 1841. It was a German, Baron von Tauchnitz, in Leipzig. And at the time, there was no copyright protection in Europe. So the British publishers, whom he knew through his own work in publishing, they were complaining that the pirates all over Europe were pirating their work. And then so he he came up with a solution with a number of British publishers and authors that he would pay them a modest fee. It was like 25 pounds or something for rights in English all over continental Europe.
They thought that it was better than nothing. Is that it?
I think they thought it was better than nothing, but also it gave them copyright protection. So it meant that it was their only means of fighting back against the pirates. And one of the requests, or one of the stipulations, I should say, was that Tauchnitz couldn't sell its books in the British Empire. When they did the same thing with American authors and American publishers, the same stipulation is there. So if you look at all of the books, it says at the bottom,
right on the front,
right? Not to be introduced into the British Empire or the USA. Yeah. It says it right at the bottom. And in fact, I'm curious, after the war, it also says the same thing. That was so that it wouldn't compete within the British or American markets with the more expensive hardcover books.
Okay, yes. And so they had some very good success. Tauchnitz had some very good success. You start off with someone who used to work at Tauchnitz, Christian Wagner.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell me a bit about him.
Sure. Christian Wagner, they'd say Wagner in German, but we'll do the Wagner. He is someone who is related to a publishing family, the Kippenbergs, who were running Insel. And Insel was one of the great German belles lettres firms of the day. And they also cared about production, and they cared about the beauty of the form. He came from a publishing family. He was a very ambitious young man. He, like many men of his generation, gets pulled into World War I. He actually volunteers to become part of the first Luftwaffe because he wants to get off the ground. But he has that sort of fighter pilot spirit certainly in him. And if you talk with his sons, they will all tell you that. And they will tell you he was a restless spirit and that he wanted to make things happen. He was an insanely good organizer of things. I mean, the man, just all of the details, but he's also very rash. So he comes along and he's working for Tauchnitz. You can see him in the letters from the late 20s that are in Leipzig. You can actually see this owner, or the manager of Tauchnitz, Hans Otto. He's writing about Wagner and how happy he is to have Wagner aboard and the things Wagner's bringing modern authors. And he actually, I don't know if you know this or not, but he was actually responsible for, on Tauchnitz books, adding a colored stripe And that happened late in his tenure, but he had this idea of people being able to easily identify books by genre. And then Albatross saturated the books with the color, right? But that supposedly that innovation comes from him. And I mean, Penguin then, of course, takes it on, right?
I was going to say, I mean, you think of Alan Lane as being such an innovator, but really he's just taking all of his ideas from Albatross, including the bird, like the fact that they're using a bird.
There's an interesting footnote on the Alan Lane story in the sense that he also almost did a joint imprint with Holroyd Reese and managed to get a lot of the secrets about economies of scale and things like that. And then suddenly was off doing his own thing and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I can't finance that. And see you later. And then he founded Penguin. But the other thing that I wanted to say about Wagner.
So are you saying that he was a little bit duplicitous? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that I find it very interesting how engaged he was in a correspondence with Holroyd Reese. And they even had a sort of informal contract written up whereby, you know, John Holroyd Reese will share with us these and these and these details, you know?
Yeah.
And then the correspondence in this particular file stopped short. And it's very interesting. I believe it's from early 34. And I do know Lane was in some financial trouble. And so I'm not saying he was inherently duplicitous, but I'm saying maybe his human ambitions got the better of him. And because
he learned all that he wanted. He learned all that he wanted to learn.
He learned what he wanted to learn. And then he went out and did it actually cheaper than Albatross. And you can see that in Sylvia Beach's notebooks. Like there's certain like Passage to India, which I have right here at the bottom of my little pile. This was an Albatross, but it became a Penguin also in the 1930s. And if you look at Sylvia Beach's notebooks, she wrote T and A on the side to say which. She was very thorough, talking about details. And you see suddenly when the Penguin version of Passage to India comes out, you suddenly see a P instead of the A. Whereas she's still buying other books in Albatross because she can't get them in Penguin. So that's in the 30s, though. Already, Penguin is starting essentially to do to Albatross what Albatross did to Tauchnitz. I mean, I'm not sure it's a question of duplicity exactly. Was Holroyd Reese duplicitous? Was Wagner duplicitous exactly? It's a businessman's world at that point in time, right?
Right.
And so if you see a way to
there wasn't a non-disclosure agreement or anything like that. I mean, there was obviously not, but it seemed if they agreed that they were going to share all sorts of company secrets, that he would expect that he continued to be part of the game.
Are you thinking about Wagner now, or are you thinking about Holroyd Reese? Holroyd Reese, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to say what's interesting is, of course, that you have Wagner getting booted from Tauchnitz because he broke a part of their code, which was they really they held firm to this idea, at least on paper, that it was a part of their honor as a firm that they wouldn't publish anything earlier than 6 months after the original hardcover had come out. And what happens, this is fascinating actually too, speaking of details, I was seeing in England in the archives these complaints on the part of certain British publishers. Like, this book came out before 6 months. This is like 1928, 1929. I only later realized, oh, Wagner was there. Yeah. He was the guy who started publishing things in advance. And he claimed Tauchnitz had done this before. I don't know about that. I haven't seen the files, but it was fascinating because he gets booted because he's published a book ahead of its time, or he's starting work on the promotion and everything. And it's an Edna Ferber title. She was with Curtis Brown. Then there's a big uproar about that. He gets booted from Tauchnitz, and he ends up, though, having won the respect of Curtis Brown, who himself was one of the biggest agents in England. He respected Wagner and wanted to work with him. And so
even though he broke the rules.
Even though he broke, well, maybe because he broke the rules, because Curtis Brown... Okay. I mean, I think that these were men of a similar, they were men of ideas. They were very innovative. They wanted to be cutting edge. So what you have is these cutting edge men who are coming together. And Holroyd Reese, for example, also with Alan Lane, they had gotten into Albatross. He went to Allen Lane because, I believe, Albatross had gotten into trouble with the British establishment publishing because sales were on the rise in paperbacks. The Brits are looking and saying, do we really want to have our authors sign with Albatross? Do we really care about this Continental editions? We should be banning it. And so you have certain publishers who are just saying outright, we're not going to American authors, like the British publisher of Sinclair Lewis said, I'm not going to publish a book in England if you sign with Albatross. That was first. So Sinclair Lewis turned down Albatross for his later works. They already had his earlier ones. But the British establishment is getting mad. They're saying, why does this benefit us anyway? So that's why Holroyd Reese goes to Allen Lane, because he wants to have the books, some of the books at least, printed in England, but he can't do that on his own. He needs a partner. So he goes to Lane to do that so they can Lane can sell them in England and in Great Britain, actually, as a whole. And Holroyd Reese can sell them on the continent.
But that falls through because Lane does his own thing.
Lane does his own thing.
Okay.
Lane essentially does what the question you asked me at the beginning, which is why are the British and American publishers not doing it on their own? And Lane comes to that. Lane says, hey, if I can do this with this other guy, why not just do it?
Okay. So let's get back to Wagner. So he gets booted from Tauchnitz and he's really ticked off and he wants to get back at them, right? So that's part of what happened with Albatross.
Sure. What happens is he actually searches for money in Germany first. He's searching for, and remember, he's related to the Kippenberg family, which had made its name in publishing. But you have to keep in mind also, 1931 is not the most auspicious time to found a competitor to a Tauchnitz, which has been around for 90 years. And the fascism is on the rise. The market is, after the American Depression, it's devastated. I mean, you have American and British tourists who have gone home. Their bank accounts no longer can afford to be abroad. So your traditional market for English language books is also drying up, if you want to think about it that way. I mean, the main audience, the way Tauchnitz envisioned it, was the tourist market. And this is so you have Wagner going to look for money in a Germany that's economically depressed, where Schacht, the economics minister, is putting bans on currency leaving the country. He wants to start a firm. Well, he can't find the money, so he goes to England instead because he has contacts there because of Tauchnitz. And Curtis Brown claims that he brought Holroyd Reese and Wagner together. Interestingly, they're both German-born men. Holroyd Reese had been living in England and brought the two of them together. So it's a pretty fascinating story of very headstrong, innovative men who jump into the breach together, and Kurt Enoch being also one of those men.
Yeah, so let's have a quick look at Holroyd Reese then, who's German. He must have changed his name then, did he?
He did change his name. His name was Johann Hermann Rees, and he changes it. He kind of keeps the JHR. And he had this real fascination with medieval culture and with this sort of the status, the elite of, he's doing paperbacks, but he has this sort of just a little bit of a minor obsession with the British elite. And he makes his own crest, and he has it in JHR, but he changes his name to John Holroyd Reese. And he's a fascinating character. Did you want me to speak briefly about him?
I do. Yeah, please.
So he's born in Germany and he lives actually in a sort of artistic community in Hellerau, which is near Dresden. And his mother is British and his father is German-Jewish. And the father dies when he's about 10. You see the photos of him. Fiona showed me the photos of him, and his father looks very German Jewish. I mean, a dark hair, beard, kind of thin, and the mother is rather sort of on the plumper British side, and so Holroyd Reese looks very much more like his mother than his father, and she sends him to school at Repton up in England when he's 11 or so. She doesn't believe in German education. She says she wants him in a good British boarding school. And there, of course, he starts to build his network. Well, by the time World War I starts, he ends up going to war. But it's a little mysterious, his whole military career. He apparently ends up, there are rumors that he was working for the British, but when he goes to get, well, I will say not even his senior officer knows that he was German born, and he was not a British citizen at the time that he's fighting. So this means he's quite good at masking who he is. In fact, the Tauchnitz leader, Hans Otto, goes looking when he sees this rival on the horizon, as I describe in the book, and he digs up some dirt. He finds out from some supposedly reliable sources that Holroyd Reese was working for British intelligence in the war, which would not be at all surprising.
Speaking about mystery, that's one of the things that runs throughout the book, is that you really don't know who on earth who's he working for? Is he a double agent? Is he working for the Germans or the British, or what's his agenda? It's very, very mysterious.
It's very mysterious, and it's one of those pieces at the end of the book, where I really, it was this tantalizing detail left, a very important detail. But I will say there's a lot of good circumstantial evidence to suggest that he's, I don't believe he was working for the Germans. I believe he probably gave them information sometimes. And I should note, by the way, I read a bunch of spy related stuff. I read parts of the official history of MI5 and MI6, and I'm reading about, what's it called, double cross. In order to figure out this mystery, I send in the Freedom of Information Act request. I'm waiting for information. I send in the Freedom of Information request here, also in the States, and I'm expecting one or the other will have some information. And I get these cryptic emails back saying things like, "We may once have had files that would have been of interest to you." You just want to weep at this moment in your detective hunt. It's where a good glass of rosé sometimes comes in handy. But I did talk with the person who wrote the official history for MI6. He was very generous. He agreed to talk to me. And he said, we emailed back and forth, and he was quite thorough, but he said it's entirely plausible, given Holroyd Reese's ability to move across borders, given his fluency in different languages, he spoke 4 or 5 different languages fluently, that he could have given information. I mean, a lot of people, there's also this thing of a lot of people gave information. There were a lot of travelers in Krause Brandstatter is in my book. He's traveling to the United States in the 30s from Germany. Well, the German Foreign Office says to him, "Hey, can you get some information for us while you're there?" So not everybody who's gathering information is inherently a spy, right? I do believe that Holroyd Reese, there are things in his profile that fit the patterns of a lot of other people working for some kind of intelligence agency. Whether that be the Ministry of Information. There's a reference somewhere that he was a personal friend of Brendan Bracken's, the Minister of Information. They both loved fast cars. They were both part of this club for fast cars. So, it's unclear to me about that. But what I do feel is that he was very much part of British Jewish circles. His contacts with other people his sympathies were very much with democracy and with the Western democracy, that he was very much fighting to keep Anglo-American culture visible as fascism was taking hold. And so for him, paperbacks and this beautiful design, to me, is not for him just about selling books. In fact, I don't actually think that Holroyd Reese ever cared about making money on this thing. For him, it was a cultural, political agenda. And I've often wondered, and this is one of the mysteries, how approved was this mission from within the British establishment? Because he's a head of the British Council. And I write about that in one of these chapters. He raises more money than the British Council gets in the 30s for promoting British culture abroad. And his language, in fact, is very much in his mission, is very much in alignment with the exact language of what the British Council wants to do abroad. So he's doing anything and he's pulling out all the stops. to see that these books get an audience and get a readership in Europe. And he's very, very, very clever about it. I will also say in the French files on him, because the French, as you know, start to suspect him in the 30s. Who is this guy? He's got all these German people coming to see him. What's going on? I realized he leaves France on September 3rd. The day the war starts, he heads back to England. He leaves right away. Why? Well, he presumably needs to be off of the continent, right? He comes back briefly, but he also, during the phony war, in the time before France actually got invaded by the Germans in June 1940, he's actually in France at certain points. I have proof he's there, but the French don't know he's there. So how did he get there? There were mysterious tales of him landing in small airplanes unauthorized in fields. And so the man is a mystery. He really is. But I would welcome, if anyone ends up with any additional information, I'd totally welcome it to help close the loop. So Nigel, if you hear of anything, let me know.
Yes. You quote Geoffrey Faber at the beginning of the book, who reminded the Chancellor of the Exchequer early in the Second World War, books are not mere merchandise. Books are a nation thinking aloud. And from a propaganda perspective, Albatross books sent British and American ideals streaming across Europe on the eve of the war.
Yeah.
So their heyday was 1932 to 1939.
Correct.
You say that 500 titles were sold at 6,000 venues throughout Europe, and they were affordable books and accessible. So big success.
Big success. In terms of propaganda, they had a hard time breaking even because they had a lot of expenses in their different offices in different places. And Holroyd Reese lived pretty large in Paris there on the Rue Chanoinesse on the Ile de la Cité. So he believed in showing the press. I mean, it was a part of the selling the books, was having this lofty establishment, being elite enough to sell paperbacks that were quality paperbacks and convince people that they were quality and elite, even though they were paperbacks. So this idea of a nation thinking out loud, it fits really well with the whole way the firm operated. And when you see the kinds of arguments the firm is making when they're threatened, then you see that they are arguing on a propaganda level as well as on the financial level. So when Kurt Enoch, for example, wants to, he's
the other third player.
He's the third person, and he's a very important person because he's in charge of marketing and promotion, and he's one of the people who helped build up those 6,000 venues across Europe. Yeah. Taubnitz had, by the way, a pretty, and the Taubnitz scholars in Leipzig will know this better than I, Tom Keiderling and Melanie Mienert and Stefan Welz and Dietmar Bunke, they'll know better than I the exact thing, but they tended, my impression is they tended to have sort of larger wholesalers with whom they would operate in different countries. And Albatross went to kind of smaller organizations or smaller bookshops also, in the way that then Penguin later went to Walgreens or
or to train station newsstands and such.
Correct.
W.E. Smith is what I'm thinking of. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And in the archives, you see that in the German archives, Albatross has to do a lot of arguing, by the way, with the German administration, especially in the financial branches, because they're getting into, without going into all the weeds and the details, they're getting into trouble, and they want to keep, the office is almost closed down in Leipzig in 1937. There's an argument made that's a pretty strong argument that it should be just shut down. And so, but you see, this goes back to the nation thinking out loud. You see Albatross arguing again and again that they are doing the German government a service. They are doing a propaganda service that the Germans, given all the ill will against Germany abroad, Germany needs goodwill, and Albatross is a part of helping to show this goodwill.
Showing the fact that they're spreading Western ideals.
For example, I mean, I think there's a piece of that the letters of Catherine Mansfield, Brave New World, of Sinclair Lewis, who's banned, he has certain books banned. That's also interesting, by the way, the Germans banned certain books by particular authors very often rather than the entire work. But you have Albatross serving a propaganda purpose in that regard, that they're a visible proof that the Germans are not cracking down on everything, right?
Yes.
But what most of the public doesn't know is that the reason Germany is willing to do that and to let these books be sold abroad is and be printed in Germany is that then they get foreign currency for that, right?
Which is really important because they're hurting that way.
They're hurting for foreign currency. They want the foreign currency anywhere they can get it. And this is where Kurt Enoch actually comes in, and you see the arguments in the documentation about his case. He's basically told, along with all the other Jewish publishers, he's also a distributor, by the way. So he's told, well, you have to sell your business to an Aryan. And he says, no way in hell I'm selling my business to an Aryan. And he appeals, and the appeal is turned down. And then they go back with bigger lawyers and bigger advocates and allies within the German system. And they really successfully argue that he should be allowed to take a portion of his business abroad. Now, this is almost unprecedented, because it's one thing to say to a Jewish publisher, get out. We don't want you here. You go, you can go, you pay us the tax, the exile, the flight tax, and then you leave. It's another to say, you're going to take 100,000, you can pay for 100,000 books and bring them with you. That's a whole other thing. And they were able to make the case, because of this nation thinking out loud logic, that Enoch, this German Jewish publisher, would be acting essentially in service, would be doing a service for the German, to win foreign currency for the Germans if he were allowed to take these books with him, because the French market was so large. It was the second largest market.
We didn't actually cover why they're printed in Germany.
Yeah. So initially they're actually printed with Mondadori in Italy. The first 18 volumes were, and Mondadori had also, by the way, funded Albatross at the beginning, which is little known. So I think personally, Mondadori, I mean, I've seen some correspondence. He was personally pretty shocked when Albatross came along and pulled the rug out and said, we're going to print in Germany. A piece of what happened is that the Germans were trying to look for any way they could to save on costs. And they basically, I'm trying to remember this.
Not the Germans, but Albatross was trying to save on costs, right? So they were looking
there was the German government had basically said to the German publishers, they needed to save 10% on costs. And that became a sort of reason, that was the reason given to Mondadori why the printing was going to be moved, because they figured out they could save more money if they moved to Germany. Their biggest market was Germany, that the biggest market for English language books in the 1930s was Hitler's Germany.
Yes.
It's in and of itself a fascinating statement. But they moved to Germany in the 30s, I believe, because Holroyd Reese is assessing that the fascist threat is worse in Germany than it is in Italy. And he's seeing the economic circumstances. He's seeing I have the German word in my head, the crackdown on, the Germans are trying to save on foreign currency wherever they can. So they're going to start reducing imports. So how are they going to get the books in if they're printed in Italy?
Yes.
Germany's not going to let them in.
Right.
So I believe that the shift to Germany and Leipzig at that time was to ensure that they had a toehold in Germany that could not be disturbed. That they knew they had a way to keep the books in Hitler's Germany. I will also say that initially, when they were forming, Tauchnitz was still in the market. But by the time they moved, Tauchnitz had been somewhat weakened. They had made overtures to Tauchnitz already. I think that they saw the writing on the wall. And so they intentionally went with the printing firm that printed Tauchnitz books.
I see. Yes.
So they found a sort of...
Because they eventually took them over, right?
They took over the management of the firm. Yes, they took over the management of Tauchnitz, which, by the way, if you think about it, and nations thinking out loud, one of the reasons that Kurt Enoch was able to leave in 36 with all of these books is, both Tauchnitz and Albatross, by the way, is that they were calculating 500,000 books sold. And that's 500,000 if you get one Reich mark per book, that's $500,000 in foreign currency coming in. It was roughly 458,000 or something like that. So there were some clever strategy behind all of it.
So you state that the crux of your book is how was a British funded publisher of English language books with Jewish ties allowed to print and sell its books within the nationalistic climate of 1930s Germany? Because it is so weird. That's strange.
It's so weird. It's I was actually pretty baffled, and from the very beginning, I mean, I stumbled upon the firm by accident, although I had been doing work on the reception history of particular Anglo-American modernists in Europe for a long time. I could speak French, I could speak German, I could read both. So it was a natural for me to kind of gravitate in that direction. I'd also lived abroad myself, and I, love these cultures. So, but when I was sitting in the French National Library researching D.H. Lawrence, I stumbled upon this, the Albatross book of short stories. And I'm, the weirdness starts there. I'm looking at the cover, as I explained in the introduction to my book, and I'm noticing these authors' names, and it's D.H. Lawrence, and it's Aldous Huxley, and it's Lewis Golding, who's Jewish, and it's Sinclair Lewis. And, these are people whom I opened the cover, and it says printed in Germany in 1934, 35. And I thought, this is very weird. How is that even possible? So that's where that's the whole seed of the book right there. The rest is detective hunting, Sherlock Holmes hat.
And again, the primary reason then is economics.
Certainly, yeah.
And then a secondary reason is they want to look as if they actually care about freedom of expression to the rest of the world. Those are the two main reasons, right?
Those are the two main reasons, yeah. And I would say that, and you have to think of Albatross also in the middle of that. Well, a footnote to what you just said, it made me think about censorship differently. I had always thought about censorship as a moral thing, that books are banned if they are not in alignment with that nation thinking out loud, if they're coming up against the ideology of the nation. And in fact, here you have, Reich literary chamber authorities saying to someone or to people who write in and complain, oh, this book is out there and there's a pro-Jewish passage, whatever. And they write back and they say, well, up until now, we've had no problem with Albatross, and they sometimes have to publish things, print things here and sell them so that we can to compete with the market abroad. But really, this series, they have this big invisibility cloak around them almost. It's very interesting. They make it through the hurdles that German books themselves are not making it through because they're in English, because the Nazis underestimate them as a threat, because of the money, because at that point, anything that brings foreign currency is worth letting go. So. Yeah.
So what happens during the war then?
It's fascinating during the war. I thought that they would have been shut down altogether. But in fact, what I found is that the books are allowed to be sold on the open market in Germany until April of 1943. They're allowed to be sold in the open market in France. Keep in mind, these are the two largest markets until April 1942.
Yeah.
And essentially, this is very weird. Also, you're talking about weirdness. Like, this makes no sense at all.
Right.
So I'm scratching my head in the archive trying to put this together and thinking, okay. And in essence, again, there are always multiple reasons with Albatross. I had said to you, we talked about the book Flights by Olga Tokarczuk, the Nobel Prize winner. And she has this great line. She said, "Constellation, not sequencing, carries truth. Constellation, not sequencing, carries truth," right? Yeah. So there's not just one linear explanation for something and why it is. And with Albatross, it's all about the constellations. It's always multiple things. And I had to learn to think in constellations. In the war, you see this also.
There's contradictions, aren't there?
Yes. And which ones did you see?
The biggest one is this whole American British ideals versus what's actually going on in Germany. That's just it's completely the opposite. And it shows, I guess, that it's money that rules.
And this goes to Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, when he's writing about how much, there's this debate in German studies about, does ideology or does money rule the day when it comes to the Nazis? And I mean, in the end, obviously it's both, but it's interesting to look at both sides and to understand how they fit together. And that was something that this project really forced me to do. I would say during the war, why are they allowed to keep printing these books? Well, early in the war, they were still selling in neutral countries. So that's actually bizarre too. You have Holroyd Reese running Albatross from London, selling Albatross books from Paris and two neutral countries. And you have the Nazis, the German custodian who's taken over the firm, selling the same books that Holroyd Reese is selling in the neutral country. So at the beginning, there's this like fight between the two different Albatrosses, and in essence, in war, which is really sort of funny. And then later, but I believe one reason it was kept alive was partly just there was so much reading hunger. There was such a lack of books. The books, you look at 1940, 1941 Christmas, these booksellers are, even the Secret Service, by the way, who are commenting on reading practices, they're saying people are sold out of everything. Like they have books left, like How to Take Care of Your Bunny Rabbit, and they have old books left that no one wants. And so in the wake of that, Germans are clamoring for entertaining reading of exactly this kind. And
yes, light reading that allows them to escape and not worry.
Yes. And in fact, one woman, even the Secret Service people quote her. She says, I just want entertaining books so that I can, when I'm in the cellar, the bomb cellar, I don't have to sit there and worry the whole time. And of course, Goebbels himself knows that he needs to keep people entertained. But this is also one of the contradictions of Albatross, right? They're there, but their position is complicated because they're, on the one hand, they're arguing to the Brits that they're serving British interests, that nation thinking out loud. And to the Germans, they're saying, no, we're part of your nation thinking out loud. I do believe their agenda was very firmly aligned with democracy and British interests and Anglo-American interests. Yeah. But in order to protect that goal, they have to take a very different stance with the Germans.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It's like, is there complicity or not, which, enables them to stay in business and keep going? To what extent are they pro-Nazi?
I would really back off from calling them pro-Nazi, but I do agree that the question of complicity is a really important one. If you think about, like, when I was reading these spy stories that my dad actually loves, and I, started to think about what's the trade-off. If you're a spy working for England, I'm not saying Holroyd Reese was a spy per se. If you're giving information to get information, you're complicit. You're giving information.
Yeah.
But you're getting something in exchange that you feel is more important than the thing that you are potentially losing. And I would say that two of the three leaders of Albatross, Kurt Enoch and Holroyd Reese, have Jewish ties in their own families. Christian Wagner is part of the German army, but he's not an anti-Semite. And it's interesting also when he is writing, he is part of the German army, though. I mean, he does fight in the war, and he gets kind of caught up in that wanting to win at a certain point. But it is a complicated, the truth, again, come back to this thing of it's constellations, right? It's a very complicated situation. He's never a member of the Nazi party. He signs his letters, instead of Heil Hitler, he signs it mit deutschem Gruß, which means with German greetings, which is this sort of little bit of a moving around the issue. So I wouldn't say they were pro-Nazi, but I would say that they complicitly operated in a Nazi Germany. I mean, this is one of the questions I ask at a certain point too, like why, and Matthias Wagner, Christian Wagner's son, asked this question, why would my father go back from Paris in 1936, the Paris that he loved? Why would he go back? Yeah. What did he go back for? In fact, his going back, and I have proof for this in various documents, was allowed because Kurt Enoch wanted to leave. And so Wagner wanted Enoch's firm. It gave him a new start for himself. And Kurt Enoch, and I think he downplayed, this Nazi thing, it'll probably go away, right? And then Kurt Enoch was able to leave because they said, okay, we don't want you here anyway. So then we get the guy we want back. But you realize how many contradictions there are within each of the individuals in question and within then the firm as a whole, also within this very complicated historical moment.
Well, and that's why me coming in with that pro-Nazi hammer like that is ridiculous, because there is this constellation and history is complicated. Yes,
but I like that you see the weirdness of the story. I kept over and over again, I was like, this is insane.
Yes.
This doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, toward the end, you give us a nice run through what happens to the main characters, and of course, Kurt Enoch is probably the most successful of
he's easily the most successful.
Yes. Yeah. He sets up the New American Library in the United States, which in 1957 alone sold 40 million books. So he's a towering figure.
He's a towering figure, and it's interesting to me that he's the person who actually succeeds the most. I would say that, I don't know, after the war, he worked for Penguin after the war or during the war here in the States, and he then split from Penguin, founded the New American Library with Victor Wainwright. But he's taking all of that knowledge of the European market and bringing American financing to that. So it's a really powerful thing. I should say it's interesting too that I've spoken with his daughter. In fact, I'm going to see her in 2 weeks again. She's 99. She just turned 99. She's still a practicing psychotherapist at 99, just a force of nature and truly amazing. But she, talked also about the travails of having to leave, and her father really always emphasizing he had to rebuild from scratch in Paris, and then he had to rebuild from scratch again. Yes. And so I do wonder also sometimes whether the fact of having to rebuild in the ways that he did also forced him to sort of hone his way of doing business. And certainly the American support and the backing of the American government and the Marshall Plan, really, he was at such an advantage then in that moment.
But interestingly, I would say, and it is wonderful to read about this success, but Holroyd Reese sticks in the mind. I want to know more about this fascinating character, but as you say, maybe his life and the details are lost to history. I don't know.
I've really tried to find out about the people individually. That was actually a key moment for me in doing the research, where I originally wanted to do a book on kind of transatlantic modernism and just look at certain volumes and tell stories about kind of the material culture, tell a different story around each book. And then I stumbled onto the personalities. And when I started that, then I started looking for their children. One of the most amazing pieces was actually trying to put these stories together and learn about them and to talk to the children about their parents. The children, and I should say, we've had multiple reunions. We've traded details, and each time we see one another, I learned some new little details here and there, stories about the different three main people. But it is fascinating, and I'm always on the lookout for more. There's one story Fiona told me about how her father,
who's Fiona?
Holroyd Reese's biological daughter, and she was raised in France. And she knew the children. She introduced me to other people who were children of Albatross employees. So the network goes beyond the network in the book, but I couldn't put everyone in. So I had to stop somewhere. But, there's an image of Holroyd Reese, she told me, where he bought all of these beautiful tulip bulbs and like just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them for his, beautiful place. And then, they don't all end up getting planted, and there's sort of, he had this obsession with beauty, and even this fact adds it's an interesting, just slight detail. His stepdaughter, Holroyd Reese's stepdaughter from a later marriage, he's married 4 or 5 times, said to me on the phone that there was a point when she was a teenager and she was sitting there and she didn't want to eat. She was misbehaving at the table or something. And he said, if you don't behave, I'm going to throw my soup at you. And he, in fact, threw his soup at her. So he was a chain smoker who suddenly from one day to the next,
Yes.
stopped.
Willpower.
Yes. So
Yeah.
this feistiness, this willpower, and I would say also one of the moving things, this is sort of related to the question of finding out about personalities, but it's been amazingly moving to me to be in contact with the children of these Albatross leaders. And so in several years ago in 2017, is that correct? 17 in the fall, Ruth Grunthal, so Enoch's daughter, came over to Hamburg and met with Matthias Wagner. And, you know, we met again in 2018 and toured the Jewish cemetery and went to the Enoch graves together. And one of her cousins came aboard, her second cousin too, also knows a lot about family history. So the circles have been expanding. It's very moving to me that and very compelling that the story has gone beyond itself. And now the book is coming out in German in March of 2022, thanks to the persistence of Christian Strasser, who's the publisher of the Europa Verlag. And he calls it the family project. So,
well, it seems to me that writing the book has added so much to your life, both in terms of the relationships that you've been able to establish, but also there's the material record too, which I love. The fact that you're going after this stuff and you're seeing the physical manifestation of their work. So combining the relationships with the material record and then just doing all the research in all these different places, it seems to me that this is exactly what you want from a book, writing a book. You're really adding to your life in a really positive way.
I would agree with that. And it's interesting too that I didn't expect it. I mean, I think when I started, I knew I had done some archival research in grad school, and I thought, okay, so I'm going to go after the story, right? The process is so enriching because you talk with this archivist and they know some other detail. And then as you started off talking about details, right? One detail leads you to another, detail leads you to another. And in that way, I came to these people too. Only gradually, we've now had 3 reunions in Hamburg, and we're having a second reunion in New York in a couple of weeks. Ruth just turned 99. There's a way, it's fascinating to get to know people through their own families rather than through your own family connection. And it has enriched my life in ways that I never would have expected. And it also, by the way, I would say kept me writing at a point when it was very stressful to try to find the time to write. And I kept thinking to myself, I can't let these people down. They've given me their stories. Their way of thinking about these stories and about their families has shaped how I write the book. It was only meeting them that I realized I could write the book as a narrative history rather than a straight history. And I have also, I should say, Matthias Wagner to thank partly for that, because I had met him in 2009. And we had talked for about 3 hours and I had kept in contact with him. But in 2012, I was suddenly sitting across from him, asking him questions. And he said, come here, come with me for a second. And he opened this cabinet and in it are these binders. And he just handed me volumes of correspondence between his parents in the 1930s, before the war. And I'm stunned walking across Hamburg with these 2 plastic bags of precious materials that he let me take them out of his house, that he trusted me, you know. And it was this amazing, it's a moment from a Hollywood movie. It was my film moment. I'm like, which movie did I get dropped into? But that is what gave me the confidence to try this new form of writing that I hadn't done before either. And to actually tell the story in a really different way, not just as a history of the firm, but as a biography also of these people who were part of it and who drove it. And who were such risk takers at this really the worst moment possible.
Yeah. Well, it's been an enriching experience to talk to you and to read the book. The next time I'm over in Europe, I did go after some of these.
Did you have any luck?
A long time ago.
Did you have any luck?
Well, I showed you my luck. That's basically, but as I say, this was quite a long time, obviously before I read your book, but I did know about Albatross and I sort of kept a bit of an eye open for them, but it's so much better when I know all about these people. As you said, when you go into a bookstore, it brings to life a lot of these books that you find.
Absolutely. And I would say I wish you good luck in the hunt, because I think they've gotten a little harder to find. Yeah, and not because I bought them all up. I only have about 50, I would say, 45, 50 of them. But yes. I have found a harder time these last times I've gone to your finding them than I did before. But maybe you never know where they're going to turn up. So I wish you very good luck in the hunt.
Okay, I got one final question. It's a detail here. I have The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg.
Sure.
By Louis Bromfield. And it's got a jacket on the paperback. Do they all have this jacket? All supposed to have this jacket?
They're supposed to have a jacket. It depends on, I'm not sure about later in the 30s, but you can see my Catherine Mansfield one has a jacket.
Yes.
And the jacket looks exactly, does yours have the same thing? The jacket looks exactly the same as the regular cover.
Yes, it does. So I'm just thinking, like, another one I've got here is The Legacy by Robert Eaton, but it doesn't have the jacket, but they're all supposed to have the jacket. Is that it?
As far as I know, at least in the early days when they were produced in Hamburg, I believe all the ones, I shouldn't say produced in Hamburg, they were all produced in Leipzig, or most of them. But I believe up and through the early 30s, yes. I can't say for sure after that. Alistair Jolins, who's a big collector, would absolutely know the answer to that question. He's going to be your contact anyway to get you the Albatross Almanac that you that your heart desires. So I will send you his information.
Well, that's great. And again, thank you for such an exciting conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was fun to wander down these lanes again.
So what are you working on now?
I've actually stayed focused on this Anglo-American books in Germany theme. I just wrote a long piece for kind of 80, 90 pages, single space, on the German book trade under the American occupation. And that'll be coming out with De Gruyter at some point for a German series called the History of the German Book Trade in the 19th and 20th Century. So it's very, the articles that people write for that are very long, very in-depth, and very informative. So that's kind of done and in the wings.
That's in
German? It will be in German. It's been translated. And they allowed me to write it in English, thank goodness. I speak German fluently, but I'm afraid that my writing would have been a bit butchered. But butchering the language, I mean. The other thing that I got really intrigued by is this English language firm out of East Berlin in the 1950s called the Seven Seas. And that firm, I've done preliminary research. I haven't written anything about it yet. I've done some talks, and but it hasn't been really a writing time lately for me. And so that firm is very intriguing because there's an American, actually, Gertrude Galbin, and she is socialist, communist leaning in the States. She meets in the 1930s at the University of Chicago. She meets Stefan Heim, who is later one of East Germany's biggest dissident authors, but they marry in Chicago. And the two of them, he had fled Nazi Germany, had fought for the Americans, was involved in propaganda operations for the Americans. Anyway, they meet in Chicago. And then when we enter Korea, they just both are so disenchanted with the United States that they leave the country. He turns into citizenship papers and they go to East Berlin because they have the hope of the new society. So that's the other project that I'm really interested in, again, in the personalities and in the expat community in East Berlin and what's happening there, and how are these books being sold. And of course, one fascinating thing is you see, like, Mark Twain is someone who's recommended to be translated into German by the American occupiers, but Mark Twain is also appearing in English in communist East Germany, which, it's just fascinating, these tensions. So that's sort of what's on the docket for now, but it's not been a writing time. It's been more of a thinking time. So perhaps we'll see what happens next.
Very good. And you're going to be teaching this fall at Hillyer College?
I am indeed. I'm already in the second week of the semester. We're all back on campus, vaccinated and masked. The energy is so much better than last semester, so I have a lot of hope for this semester. And one of these days we'll be able to take our masks off and
see each other.
see each other again. Exactly.
Yes.
Not only over Zoom, but in other places. So, but I want to thank you so much for this conversation that has been wide ranging, and I hope you'll make it to a Sharp conference someday.
Well, I did make it to the one in Amherst. I was there.
That's one of the ones I missed, strangely.
Okay. And I was able to interview Jonathan again when I was there about Sharp, because of course he's one of the founders.
Co-founders, yeah.
Yeah. So, but let me just read out. Michele K. Troy is, as we've just mentioned, a professor of English at Hillyer College at the University of Hartford. She studies Anglo-American literary modernism in continental Europe in the decades between, beyond the two.
Beyond, it's gone beyond, yes.
the two world wars. Thanks so much again.
Thank you so much for your time and all of your wonderful questions.